All right, let's jump right into this explainer and look at how Andrew Jackson essentially sent shockwaves through the entire American political system. I mean, we're talking about an era that completely redefined the presidency, shattered the old norms, and honestly laid the groundwork for the modern political landscape we see today. Jackson wasn't just a president, he was a massive, fundamental disruption to the status quo. To really wrap our heads around this chaotic era, we're going to break down 6 distinct phases of disruption. We'll start with the people's president, move through the nullification crisis, the bank war and the Whigs, Indian removal and resistance, the Panic of 1837, and finally, the wild election of 1840.
So let's kick things off with Section 1, the People's President.
Now, before Jackson came along, Washington was pretty much run by an elite, established old guard. But Jackson, he came from super modest roots and completely brushed off that typical Washington high society life. He brought this entirely different, raw energy. I mean, he famously threw an inauguration day party that was so raucous, it literally left the White House a total mess. But beyond the wild parties, he instituted what we now call the spoils system. He built a cabinet that balanced out the different regions of the country, sure, but he filled it with guys he personally knew and trusted, rather than those traditional political elites. For Jackson, loyalty was absolutely everything.
Moving right along to Section 2, the nullification crisis. So at this time, slavery is this deeply contested issue, just constantly lurking in the background, especially as South Carolina starts pushing hard for more state autonomy. The immediate spark for this crisis, though, was something called the Tariff of Abominations. Now, this tariff was great for New England and the western states, but the South absolutely despised it. Why? Well, it simultaneously hiked up the prices on the manufactured goods they desperately needed to buy, while at the same time shrinking their crucial southern cotton markets. It was just an absolute economic disaster for the South.
And here's where it gets really intense. That economic friction snowballs into a massive political standoff. Vice President John C. Calhoun actually pushes for nullification. This was the radical idea that individual states could just straight up reject any national law they didn't like. As you can imagine, Jackson was furious with his own VP. He felt the tariff was good for the country as a whole. So what does he do? He pushes through the force bill, which literally gave him the power to use the U.S. military to keep states in line and force them to pay up. The entire nation is teetering on the edge of armed conflict here. But right at the brink, Henry Clay swoops in with the compromise tariff, promising to gradually lower those rates. Calhoun gets South Carolina to back down, Jackson drops the force bill, and somehow, both sides walk away claiming victory without firing a single shot. But Jackson's aggressive, strong-arm tactics definitely ruffled a lot of feathers. People were incredibly polarized by him. His critics actually drew him in political cartoons as King Andrew I, depicting him as a literal monarch, trampling right over the Constitution and a map of the United States. It's a perfect snapshot of the intense divide he caused. His critics were genuinely terrified that he was expanding executive power to tyrannical levels.
All right, that brings us to Section 3, the Bank War and the Whigs.
Heading into the 1832 election, nothing was more divisive than the National Bank. Henry Clay strategically tries to corner Jackson by bringing the bank up for a recharter, but Jackson just boldly vetoes it. And even though that veto was incredibly controversial, the voters didn't seem to care. Jackson easily crushed the 1832 election. Plus, having totally had it with Calhoun by this point, he swaps him out for Martin Van Buren as his new VP and marches into his second term with a massive mandate. However, that landslide victory and his total destruction of the National Bank triggered a huge backlash. In fact, it directly caused the birth of a completely new political faction with one singular goal: taking down Andrew Jackson. This was the birth of the Whig Party. American politics literally reorganized itself entirely around one question: are you with Jackson or are you against him?
Now we have to look at Section 4, Indian removal and resistance.
During his second term, Jackson's administration presented Native Americans with 2 really devastating, impossible options. Option 1, abandon your entire culture, adopt the quote-unquote white way of life, and become a good citizen. Or Option 2, leave your homeland completely. But tragically, even the many Native groups who chose Option 1, who completely assimilated and adopted white customs, were still forcibly mandated to evacuate their ancestral lands. The choice they were given was basically a total illusion. Now, Native American groups didn't just take this lying down. They actually fought back, using the American legal system itself. And they won. In two major Supreme Court cases, Chief Justice John Marshall upheld the natives' rights to keep their lands. The highest court in the land said the law was on their side. But Jackson notoriously and just completely defiantly responded with a chilling quote. John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. He just entirely ignored the Supreme Court's ruling, which really shows you the terrifying, unchecked extent of his executive power.
That outright defiance led directly to the most prolonged, tragic removal of all, the Cherokee removal. The reality of this was the Trail of Tears, a brutal, forced march spanning hundreds of miles all the way to Oklahoma. The conditions on this march were just horrific, and thousands of Native Americans tragically died along the way. It absolutely stands as one of the darkest policies ever carried out by the U.S. federal government.
It is super important to note, though, that not all tribes were successfully removed. The Seminoles down in Florida fought back against the United States military with incredible fierce resistance. The scale of this conflict was staggering. The U.S. lost many soldiers and burned through a mind-boggling $20 million, and yet they still never fully forced the Seminoles out. So in some cases, that fierce resistance actually held the line against Jackson's Removal Act.
Let's pivot now to Section 5, the Panic of 1837.
Up until this point, easy credit was flowing, and it seemed like the profits would just never end, right? Especially as Southern plantation owners were buying up land and slaves on credit to feed Britain's massive demand for cotton. But then, the dominoes start falling. First, Britain suffers a terrible harvest. Second, facing a sudden cash crunch, British banks start demanding immediate repayment of all that credit from America. Third, because British demand suddenly plummets, American cotton prices absolutely crash. And finally, step 4, Americans can't repay their debts, which triggers massive bank runs. Rich or poor, it didn't matter. Everyone felt this. Thousands lost their jobs, and it kicked off a brutal economic panic that dragged on for years. Naturally, many pointed the fingers straight at Jackson's previous banking policies, and the Whigs used this massive disaster to scoop up a ton of political power. Right in the middle of all this economic chaos, we also see a massive shift in how the country handles business law. This is highlighted by a huge Supreme Court case. Basically, on one side, you've got the Charles River Bridge in Boston. They've held a charter since 1785 and are raking in a very comfortable $30 grand a year in tolls. On the other side is the brand new Warren Bridge, built right nearby. The Charles Bridge sees its traffic slashed in half, so they sue, arguing their original charter basically guaranteed them a legal monopoly. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney takes this case, and his ruling is an absolute game changer. He declares that a state charter does not automatically grant a monopoly. The court idea here was that old established businesses have to make way for new innovation. This set a massive, massive precedent for American capitalism. It cemented the idea that the government is there to encourage competition, not just protect outdated monopolies. Which brings us to our final act, Section 6, the Election of 1840. By the time 1840 rolls around, the Whigs are absolutely fired up to take the White House. And they do something brilliant. They take Jackson's very own populist playbook and use it right against the Democrats. They put forward William Henry Harrison, a famous old general from the Battle of Tippecanoe, and pair him with John Tyler for VP. Then they blanket the country with this incredibly catchy rhythmic slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. They weren't even really arguing about policy, they were just running entirely on vibes and sheer populism. And here's where a political insult totally backfires. The Democrats tried to smear Harrison, saying he was just some simpleton who'd be happier sitting in a log cabin drinking hard cider. Big mistake. That totally alienated everyday Americans. The Whigs flipped the script, embraced the whole log cabin thing, and painted Harrison as the ultimate man of the people. It drove massive voter turnout, and Harrison actually won. But it takes a really dark, ironic turn. Trying to prove he was still tough and vigorous, Harrison gave this ridiculously long inauguration speech in the freezing cold. He caught pneumonia and died just 1 month into his term. So now, John Tyler is president, but Tyler didn't actually agree with any of the Whig policies. He got completely excommunicated from his own party, and every single one of Harrison's cabinet members, except for one, resigned in protest. It was just complete and utter chaos. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want you to ponder this final thought. We've just watched the invention of the populist campaign, an intense clash between state and federal power, the total weaponization of the economy, and the truly tragic consequences of unchecked executive action. So, when you look around at our modern political battles today, the fights over populism, the economy, the balance of power, how much of it traces directly back to this one disruptive era? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. I hope breaking it down like this really illuminated the complicated roots of our American system. Until next time, keep questioning the history that shapes our present.